Welcome. This is the Ag Engineering Podcast, where we talk tools, tips, and techniques to improve the sustainability of your farm. I am your host, Andy Chamberlain from the University of Vermont Extension, and this podcast is supported by Northeast SARE, providing grants and education to advance innovation in sustainable agriculture. We're trying to improve the industry by chatting with farmers and getting their input on tools, tips, or techniques that have changed the way they farm for good. Many of these practices affect multiple areas of the farm. Whether it be environmentally, emotionally, physically, or financially, we share the knowledge to promote sustainable agriculture, lifestyle, and business. Thanks for having a listen. Now, let's get started. Today's episode comes to you from Middlesex, Vermont, where we are speaking with Patrick Sullivan of Ananda Gardens. He and his wife have been farming the last 5 years, and they're growing 1.5 acres with a 1/4 acre under high tunnels. They're in the climate zone 4, and they run 150 member CSA, and 1/4 of their business is wholesale, going to restaurants. Last year, 50% of their business was restaurant sales, so that was a bit of a change going into 2020, was the increase of that CSA member. With that, they're bringing in about $175,000 in gross sales. So, Patrick, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks for having me.
Today, we wanted to talk about the use of compost and how you use that as a high production system growing on such a small space. So, if you could tell me a little bit about it, how are you doing this?
Yeah. So we are using compost to initially make our garden beds. Where we have a lot of production off of a small area. So we really wanted to make our soil as fertile as possible. So basically, when we go and build our garden beds, we are making sure that all the grass is killed, either plowing it under or covering it with tarps. And then initially, I just pick up with my tractor, the front loader on my tractor, basically large amounts of compost, dump them all over the field, and then we rake them out, and that becomes a permanent bed system. So we've experimented with, trying to dump them in just with my tractor, drive across the field and dump piles that would then become long 100-foot beds. And I've also experimented with just dumping piles all over the field and raking that out, and then that whole thing we make our beds basically on top of that. So I kind of look at it as you're like raising the floor of the garden with this initial huge dose of compost, something between 6 and 8 or 10 inches. And then you're really growing right into that. So especially the first year, the plants, you're basically growing in compost. And then in the subsequent years, we are still adding compost, but not nearly that much. So we're basically driving with the tractor on the garden bed one time to make it, and then we're using wheelbarrows to supplement and add half as much or 1/4 as much in the after the initial phase of building the garden.
So when you're building the garden, are you raking out the piles from the bucket loader, or are you raking out the aisleways to then make a raised bed and kind of wallow out a footpath?
So we've tried it both ways. Generally, we are dumping these piles and then raking them by hand. And at first, we were really dumping them in one long line and then marking our beds with string lines. We grow on it's about 34-inch beds and 14-inch paths. And then, so we wouldn't have to necessarily shovel the paths out. We were just raking this compost right in the garden beds, raking a little bit out of the paths. But we found it easier, especially this year, as we just have time crunch. We need to get garden beds built quicker. because we just have so much harvesting and planting to do. It's quite a bit easier to just spread it evenly over the whole garden, not worry about the paths. Our feet will compact the paths. So it becomes a little bit of a raised garden bed, but we found over time, even if we're take more time and really focus on making these raised beds, they'll settle over time. So um, it's all one level after a year or two. And in our climate, our soil is so well drained here that, which is pretty unique for where we are, that we don't really need raised beds. We don't find an advantage per se of having a bed that's 6 or 8 inches higher than the path you're walking in. And actually, I have gardened that way before, and it can become quite an inconvenience because you need to maintain that bed, the edge of the bed, which is tricky if it's on a slope. It's been easier if it's just all one flat surface.
If you're starting out with the field kind of evenly spread with the compost, are you leaving strings in place, or how do you know where the walkways are so things you don't have narrow rows and wide rows?
Yeah, good question. I'm pretty finicky about that. I really want our feet to land in the same path. I don't want to be shifting these beds around. So we're still experimenting with it. At first, we would just stake the beds up as we were turning them over. Now we have some stakes that we just leave in the garden, but we find them kind of a nuisance. You trip over them, the wheelbarrow doesn't pass over them well. You're carrying a bucket of heavy produce, and it's kind of in front of your body, and you're not looking down, so it can be kind of a hazard. So what we're moving towards is just having one edge of the bed staked, being able to string that line. If we need it, we can put a temporary stake on the other edge, like measure it out with a tape measure, put the other stake in. That's a little bit more manageable than having every single path staked, the edge of every bed. So you have a stake every 14 inches on the paths and then 34 inches on the bed. It's a lot of stakes out there, and they can really get in the way. So I like more the one stake, and then we can run a string line off that, plant off that, so our beds stay really straight. And then the paths aren't varying that much. They stay within the range of what we want them, 14 inches. The beds don't get much narrower or much wider. There's probably a little bit of variability, but it's nothing that affects our production. And I have to say that we're really into things that would take, if there's a way we could do it and it's almost as good, but it takes half the time, we will often do it that way. So rather than have the whole bed staked, if you can just, especially, if I'm doing the direct seeding or planting, we use a paper pot transplanter. So if I'm doing that, I can really keep a straight line. And for the garden crew, we will often stake it out just because maybe they don't have as much experience or they're not here every single day. So we will generally stake the whole bed out just to try and keep the bed straighter. But I have noticed if I'm direct seeding, I can just go off that one straight line, and the beds stay really straight enough.
No, that makes sense. If you've got stakes on one side of the bed, in your next row, you just kind of have to hug that side, and it automatically makes the second edge. So
yeah, and you know how many rows you're dropping out, so the bed stays within the range of 34 inches.
So after your beds are made, the initial spring, when do you add additional compost?
We ideally every time you flip the bed, we would add some compost, but it does depend on just when we have compost here. Sometimes we'll go through all our compost and we won't have any on hand. So there's enough compost out in the whole garden that if we miss putting compost in there between a bed flip, it's not the end of the world. But ideally, we would be putting out some compost every time we turn the bed over. Generally, we have more compost here in the spring and in the fall, so those are the times where we're we're doing the bulk of laying out the compost, which I suppose doing it that way also works quite well because we can just make these big pushes of putting a lot of compost on the garden when we're not in the summer months where just so much of our work is dedicated to harvesting and processing vegetables. In the fall, some of our root crops are in and already harvested, or in the spring, we're seeding, but we're only harvesting a few crops. So it's a good time to have the whole crew focus on this task and really get a lot of compost out on the garden. It is nice to get a bunch of beds made in the fall, so you don't have that pressure to be making the beds and planting them in the spring. Because here we've been losing our snow end of April, and basically the day after the snow is off the garden, we really like to plant a bunch of the garden out and then cover it with row cover. So having some beds made from the previous fall is fantastic.
Now that you've been in the field here for the last 4 years or so, you're not really taking the tractor out there much, are you? If they're permanent beds, you're just topping it off every spring?
Correct. We're not after that kind of initial garden building phase where we're driving the tractor on the field. Then it's all with wheelbarrows. So we'll load. We've got a number of wheelbarrows, so we can put two wheelbarrows kind of facing each other at the front of the garden, and then dump a tractor bucket full of compost in there. So if we have three of us working on it, we can get a ton of compost out. And then that way we're not driving over the beds that we've already made. We are also broad forking in the first year or two. After that, we don't find that we need to broad fork very often. But especially after we've driven the tractor all over the field, we're taking the time to broad fork each bed before we initially plant it, and then as we're flipping it for that first year or two, basically as much as we have time for or we can, we'll also broad fork it as we flip the bed over. And then to flip the beds over, we're just as much as we can just planting right into the bed with doing the least prep possible. How that has really evolved. When we started our farm, I have a BCS and a rotary harrow, and even this summer I've been using it some to flip over salad beds, because people who are gardening in this style, I bet will know that growing mixed greens and salad crops are the most challenging, because a lot of crops you can just move down the bed pretty quickly and pull them out, like lettuce or even brassicas. But salad greens are planted so densely that it takes so much time to pull them out by hand. So we've done some experimenting with we used to do a lot more with the rotary harrow, but really noticed how much it kind of fluffs even the rotary harrow that is not rototilling the soil and slamming it against a hood on the back of the little machine or the implement. The rotary harrow just mixes the soil horizontally, but it still fluffs the soil so much that the quality of the soil, the tilth of the soil, all of the the particle size of the soil just gets so homogeneous that we really are shying away from even using that tool. That I read about last year somebody solarizing, and once the sun is strong enough at a high enough angle, so for us that's starting in June, we can just put a piece of old greenhouse plastic, or in our case we just have these 4-foot wide sheets of greenhouse plastic. We put them on the bed for a day, and the greens underneath get totally cooked. You can just move down the bed very quickly with a rake to rake off any debris that's left, and then plant right into that. And we've just noticed so much better soil quality after doing that than after using the rotary harrow to turn the greens beds over. So that's kind of our plan now. In the spring and fall, we will work down the bed and pull the greens out by hand, especially in the high tunnels, as that space is so valuable that we want to flip the beds just as quickly as we can. But we're even doing that in the field once the solarization doesn't work because the sun isn't strong enough. If you put the plastic down in the fall, it will make the crops grow better. They'll like it, but in the summer they really just get burned off. And from what I've read, you're really just you're heating the very surface of the soil. If you go down an inch or two, you're not doing significant damage to the soil microbiology. So that's been a great addition to, a technique to flip beds in this style of gardening.
So when the crop's done, you solarize it and then just rake off whatever didn't get broken down, and that's enough of a surface tilth that you can paper pot into that, or are you hand transplanting at that point?
We can paper pot into that. We can direct seed with the jang. It does leave, the soil is nice enough to just go right down and plant with the jang. We hand transplant just some of the bigger crops like kale, broccoli, cauliflower, but pretty much everything else we're paper pot transplanting. So yeah, correct, exactly as you stated. Once it's solarized, just rake it off. We'll put any amendments in at that point and plant right into it. So it's a really quick turnover. You do have to, take the time to lay the plastic down and put some. In our case, we have just some pavers that were on the farm that we pulled up from a project, from a home renovation. So that's generally what we use. We do have some sandbags, but the sandbags, one gets left out there for a while, or they open up, they spill sand. That's been a source of weed seed for us. And then they also just eventually shatter. The plastic can shatter. So we don't love using the sandbags to weigh the plastic down. The pavers work pretty nicely, especially because it's a thicker greenhouse plastic. It doesn't rip. So you put the plastic down, you put the pavers on top of it every 10 or 15 feet, and then the next day you come back and just take it off. And often we will be solarizing a bed that's in the same block of garden beds in the same area of the garden, so we can just pull it right over to the next bed we'll be doing. But it works quite nicely, and we don't have to solarize a huge area at once. We can just do it a couple beds at a time. So that's worked great for us.
And just a day of sunlight. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, just a day of sunlight. Sometimes it'll get left on there for 2-3 days, but if it's a sunny day, all it needs is a day.
This heavy use of compost, is this different than how you farmed earlier in your career? And has it really improved practices for you? Obviously, it has improved practices for you, but what's your biggest takeaway of improvement that it's made?
Oh, my biggest takeaway of improvement is the quality of the crops, the storage of the crops. I should say, when we first started our business here in central Vermont, we were on leased land. So we didn't, and we were also just starting out, so we didn't have a lot of capital to work with. So we shied away from using compost, and we just worked with the soil that we had. And as soon as we got our own land and could afford to put some more compost in, I knew that was the direction we wanted to go. So I couldn't speak highly enough about compost. It's just made such a big difference. I went on Google Earth a couple months ago and looked. There was an old picture of our farm, and the soil looks so much different. I mean, the soil has gone in the 4 years since we've been doing it on this property. Really, that second year we started laying down quite a lot of compost, and this year we just doubled our production area. How much the soil has changed in that time is unbelievable. It went from a really light colored sandy soil to just a dark, rich uh, soil filled with earthworms and different sized soil particles, fungus. There's fungus in the garden. There is, yeah, there's just so much life in the garden soil. You can smell that. It smells so good, um, which is apparently we are just as humans, we're incredible. We've got an incredible sense of smell of really rich soil. You know, it's something that we've evolved knowing how to identify. So it's just something that's really pleasing to pick up a handful of soil and it just, you can smell the health in the soil. And I mentioned, yeah, just how well our crops are storing. That I think as they get more nutrient dense because they're grown in a living soil, we're just finding the quality of the crops and the storage is better. And that's, you know, something that could be hard to quantify, but it's something that we've noticed anecdotally over the time that we've been doing this. I would like to start working with a refractometer, which would allow us to really get a sense of how well plants are photosynthesizing. But we have just our field stays green longer. The plants just look healthier. There's definitely still some plant disease present on certain crops or things that we deal with that I'm sure most farmers deal with. But overall, I think just the overall health and vitality of the farm has just improved so much. We're on our acre and a quarter, moving towards acre and a half. We are talking about a couple hundred yards of compost, more than a couple hundred yards of compost at this time. So at this point, so it's a really large volume of compost. It's a large investment. And I think the biggest thing that's changed is just having land security, knowing that we're going to be able to farm here for a significant amount of time and taking the leap to make that kind of investment. We make that kind of investment in high tunnels, we make that kind of investment in equipment, but sometimes maybe that seems like just so much money to outlay for compost. But I would rather have really healthy soil than a brand new shiny tractor. We've we do. I have to say that I never imagined that I would love our tractor so much. It's just helped us move around so much compost and materials and take some pressure off of our bodies because we really couldn't be doing this without the help of a machine. It would just, it's already, I'm now in my mid 30s and it's, I wouldn't want to be building these beds when I'm in my 50s or my 60s necessarily. It has been taxing on the whole farm crew, so we try and spread out the work as much as we can and just do it in pushes rather than trying to bite off too much at one time. The last thing that has really changed is the soil's ability to hold water. This summer we were in a moderate drought here in central Vermont, and we still just had to water our crops when we plant them or when we're direct seeding. But other than that, we were not irrigating, and we had absolutely great production levels. So once the soil has so much life, has so much organic matter in it, it's really able to hold on to a lot more water. There's some pretty phenomenal statistics of how many liters. I think it's 70,000 liters of water for every 1% you increase soil organic matter per acre. So we've really seen that. We're running off of our home well at this point, so we don't have access to endless amounts of water. And we haven't run our well dry. We haven't had any problems with water. And I really think that the investment in compost has made that possible. So, in the face of just a pretty uncertain climate that we're moving into, that we're in, I think it's a fantastic investment to improve your soil.
That's awesome because it was a really dry growing season. You mentioned the cost. How much are you investing on an annual basis to fill your farm with compost?
We are, hold on one second, I will pull it right up. So for the last 2 years, we've been investing in the realm of $8,000 a year in compost. And I think buying compost at these quantities, people should really look for someone who's willing to work with them and give them a decent price. So if we are buying, $8,000 worth of compost, we're looking at 200 yards of compost per year the last 2 years that we've put down. Some really high quality compost around here goes for $85 a yard. We're able to get it cheaper than that, and I think that's really important. If we had to pay $85 a yard, we could not be putting down these levels of compost. You don't necessarily need a product that is super refined. I think the most important thing is that it doesn't have weed seeds in it. So the compost we're putting down is not bringing in any new weed problem. We're really just smothering the seed bank that we already had. And it often, there are some wood chips. The compost has been a little bit woody. That as long as we're putting amendments down, that has not been an issue. I should mention that our use of amendments has gone down. So we were putting down 25 pounds a bed on, the kind of high feeding crops. We were putting down 25 pounds a bed of ProGrow, which is a balanced organic fertilizer, and now we're down to a third of a bag, and we've seen no decrease in production. So over time, I think as the soil gets healthier, the plants can access more nutrients that they need. You'll go down on your other fertilizer costs, and so that's also a potential real benefit.
And we were talking offline, you said it's really reduced your labor cost in weeding everything too.
Yeah, true. That first year when we weren't using heavy amounts of compost, we were out there weeding every 2 weeks. We're weeding the whole garden, and now I don't think we've picked up that many hand tools in the last couple years. We literally are just doing some hand weeding. Oftentimes, harvesting is the bulk of when we're in the garden. So as we're harvesting, we might have a bucket nearby that we can just pull some weeds. Any weed that's going to seed. I'm like pretty fanatical about trying to get out of the garden. So pigweed, plantain are a couple of the weeds that we still have that are blowing in, and we're just, as you're walking through the garden, scouting for them. But it is essentially taken weeding from being a really significant task on the farm to one that's almost non-existent. That's another huge benefit. We would rather be spending our time, on tasks that really earn money. Like our customers aren't gonna see how much we're weeding. They're not necessarily, they're not gonna pay more for our vegetables if we're having to weed a lot. So we really would love to be focusing more on planting and harvesting and washing, because those are things that will really, pay for us to be able to keep doing this and pay for us to hire help and pay people well to work here.
Yeah, I'd much rather put the money into compost that seems to gain you multiple benefits versus time spent.
Yeah, likewise.
Weeding.
And I think compost will give you years of benefits. I mean, your initial benefit is really smothering the weed seeds out, giving you a nice soil tilth to grow in, and the long-term benefits are really the improved soil structure, the improved, the nutrition that the plants can have access to. So there are those short-term benefits, but the real benefit of compost comes in the more mid to long term.
another thing I was thinking about that $8,000 is nothing to blink an eye at. When you're running a business, I mean, there's a lot of benefits and labor savings and input costs and all of that. But we were talking offline also about how you used to make your own. I mean, that trying to make that volume of compost on your own would take up so much time. If you valued your time, you couldn't make that much material for $8,000. And geez, that's a lot of that's a lot of material handling.
Yeah, agreed that the compost makers, I mean, a huge part of their business is developing, as we do in production farming, we're developing relations with our customers and also with our suppliers. Compost makers are the same, so they're really dedicating a lot of time to finding good raw bulk materials at a good price. And we don't necessarily have the time to do that. We've brought some manure in or different materials, but the price point that we're paying might be probably is a lot higher than a compost maker because they're just buying so much of it. Or we've also had an issue where we're counting on it, but it doesn't come through. We have a bunch of compost ready to be made, but the farm can't get us the manure when we think they can. So rather than kind of dealing with that at this point in our business, it's been a lot better to just buy it in. What we do make, we have spread around our home production. So we're growing tons of berries and around our home and our home garden. We've used the on-farm compost for that and also for fruit tree plantings. But we have seen much more weed seeds in it. We're not able to kill all the weed seeds. We're not taking care of our compost the way that the compost maker does. So it's been a huge benefit to just buy in a product that we can use without worrying whether we're bringing a problem onto our farm. And it could cost so much more to bring in a ton of weed seeds than it's even worth. Or you could create a real problem by putting a compost down that's just filled with a weed seed. So it's been great for us to just buy that in. I think even at 200 yards, we would be putting significant wear on our tractor to make it and turn it. So at that level or a little bit more, you might be looking at having to maintain another piece of equipment, a front loader, or a little bobcat just to make that amount of compost. So that's adding another big expense to the farm. So rather than pay for maintaining that piece of equipment now, we've just chose to purchase in our compost. That said, we have somebody that we love working with, maybe in different contexts where you do have access to a lot of inexpensive material and maybe a piece of equipment that you can use or invest in. It could make sense to make your own compost too. I really like making compost. Maybe we'll go that way in the future. It's kind of exciting for me, but for now, this has worked out great to just buy it in.
And when you're buying it in, you also know it's the right mix. Have you had any like the right mix, fungal versus bacterial and all of that, so the crops respond well to it? Have you had any crops that just do not like it?
That's a good question. Not specifically crops that haven't done well because of the compost. None that I can think of off the top of my head. The
Well, that's good.
Yeah. And as far as the bacterial and fungal dominance, I think our compost has tended more towards the fungal side than many farms would use, because somebody else that the compost maker is making compost for runs a nursery and really requests a lot of wood chips. We haven't found that to be a huge problem yet. I'm really interested in taking the soil food web course and learning more about that. But from what I have heard, you could create too much of a fungal dominance in your garden and it could start to harm your production, but we haven't gone there yet. We've been laying wood chips down in the pathways of one of the sections of our garden, two of the sections of our garden, experimenting with that. But from what I'm now learning, I think we wouldn't necessarily lay wood chips down every single year because you could push the garden too much towards the fungal dominance, and you still really want more of the bacterial dominance in a annual vegetable garden. But that said, even though we're using compost that is probably more towards the fungal end of what a lot of vegetable gardens would use, we have not had a problem.
Seems like you've got a pretty good feel for the systems on your farm. Is there any bottleneck or things that you really wish you could change or you're looking forward to changing in the future?
Well, I think one thing to think about if you were setting up a farm like this, on our acre and a quarter to acre and a half scale, I think the way we're doing it works fine. We have three part-time helpers, so an equivalent of two full-time people working on the farm, and that works well for us. But I think if you were doing this in on a larger volume, or you were doing this in a place where you couldn't find really great reliable help, I would consider making your beds the width of your tractor, and there people are working on some pretty nifty implements to be able to scoop up compost and then lay it directly down on the beds. So you could potentially save that step of being able to drive your tractor right on the field, straddle the bed, and drop the compost right out of like a manure spreader or out of some implement. So that would be one thing that I would think about. And maybe as I get older and don't want to handle so much compost, I don't think we'll have to use the levels of compost that we've been using in the future. But say that I were starting the farm and in my 50s or 60s, or were in a different context, I might seriously think about laying the farm out that way rather than these narrower beds that we're having to wheelbarrow materials around. So that could be one potential bottleneck. And then, yeah, so one thing, we built our greenhouses, and a lot of people put a garage door on a greenhouse or big wide doors. We have a single, like a man door or a double man door on our greenhouses. So we can't drive our tractor in the greenhouse, and I'll put a tarp down in front of the greenhouse and dump a bunch of compost, and then we're taking it in by hand. That works well. I would consider we're just putting up a new greenhouse, and I did make one door wide enough to potentially at least fit the tractor bucket in there to dump a bunch of compost in. I think that's something to think about because especially in the spring when you could be there's a bunch of snow on the compost pile, or there's snow on the farm and you can't drive the tractor around so easily. So getting compost in an area where then it could be used in kind of the shoulder seasons or the off season of growing would be something to think about. Moving, I mean, in general, I would say just moving heavy weights around is the bottleneck. Thinking about how to be able to do this for a while and not wear yourself out. So wherever you could just lift things one time, however you could reduce the need to, even like I mentioned on the greenhouses where we dump it on a tarp, then all that compost needs to be lifted up into a bucket or into a wheelbarrow, versus the way we dump it out on our garden beds where I'm just dumping the tractor bucket right into compost or right into wheelbarrows. And then those wheelbarrows are dumped right onto the bed, and then it's just raked out. So that eliminates, the compost never needs to be shoveled or lifted. I think that's an area to just put some thought into your system. You don't want to be shoveling 200 yards of compost a year or paying someone else to do that because it'll get old quickly. And yes, time better spent washing and packing produce.
Certainly, all good points. Well, that wraps up my questions. Is there anything else that you wanted to share on this episode?
Yeah, I guess what the last thing that I would want to share with the audience is just thinking about responsible ways to grow vegetables. That tillage, um, will damage the soil. Tillage will really add so much air into the system that you're burning up organic matter. And I think farming on in this method really, um, the scale will probably be quite a bit smaller. But at the same time, I think we're able to produce quite a lot more food per acre than we would if we were all set up to cultivate, to till mechanically and cultivate mechanically. So I think that's a very positive trade-off, not only for the people who own and work on the farm, but also for the soil. That farming in this way, we're able to really just steward an incredibly healthy landscape. We're able to create so much more soil life rather than destroy it. So I'm a huge advocate, and I really, I've seen huge benefit farming in this way for us, and I think people should definitely look into this style of growing more. There's a couple great books that I would recommend. The No-Till Intensive No-Till Farming, I believe that's the title, by Brian O'Hara at Tobacco Road Farm. There's a great book by Andrew Mefford, who is the editor of Growing for Market magazine. A couple years ago, he went around, well, you could still visit a lot of farms, went around and interviewed a bunch of people who have different styles of this no-till growing, and highlighting their practices, their successes, the things that are harder in their context. So I think that's a fantastic book. And yeah, reading. I really encourage reading about this style of growing. I think it's a style of growing too that has been around for a long time. And as I was studying gardening and agriculture, came across just the high point of market farming. A lot of people think was before World War II in Europe and in France, because as people were coming in and out of Paris, they were dumping off massive amounts of horse manure because everything was horse and buggy, and then bringing, so there was a trade-off that all that manure was able to stay on the farms that were even within the city limits, and the farms had access to just so much fertility. They were able to produce so much food. So I think it's really proven for a long time that this method of farming can produce a lot of food on a small acreage, and that's really benefit for the family who's running the farm or the individual who's running the farm, and also for nature. So that's my pitch for no-till gardening, and really encourage people to try it out. Try it out in one little section of your garden. Try it out on a bed, or definitely in greenhouses. I think it makes a ton of sense in greenhouses. So yeah, any questions, can feel free to reach out to me and go to those resources that I mentioned. And thank you so much for having me on the show, Andy.
Yeah, no, thanks for leading by example and sharing how these practices work on your farm. If others want to follow up with you and see what you're up to and how you're doing it, how can they do that?
Go to our website at www.anandagardens.com. Can reach out directly to me at info@anandagardens.com. We don't have a real social media presence, but maybe we'll get some YouTube videos up at some point and give a little tour of the farm. So yeah, stay tuned for that.
Well, sounds good. And thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you, Andy.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you learned something today or plan to make a change on your farm, let me know. I'd love to receive any feedback you have. Just click the link in the description to submit the form. It will help the future of this podcast to be a resource that is helpful for you. And while you're at it, I hope you go ahead and subscribe, share this with a friend, or leave a comment. And if you want more information, check out the show notes on our website at agengpodcast.com. That's agengpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and I hope you have a great day.
The proceeding has been a production of University of Vermont Extension. For more information on Extension, log on to www.uvm.edu/extension.